He stared into his coffee. Fewer people remember it. That answer disturbed me more than if he'd claimed the place was haunted. My patrol began at 10 as usual. The air felt unusually cold inside Corridor D. Cold enough that my breath became faintly visible beneath the fluorescent lights. Temperature reading: 48 degrees. Impossible. The heating system supplied the entire building through a shared network. No other hallway measured below 68. I radioed maintenance. No response. Only soft bursts of static. I checked nearby corridors. Normal temperature. Returned to Corridor D. 48 again. The cold ended exactly at the painted line separating the hallway from the adjoining corridor. One step forward. Warm. One step back. Cold. Like crossing an invisible wall. I noted everything carefully. Time. Temperature. Equipment serial number. Environmental conditions. Procedure first. Conclusions later. As I approached cell 14, something caught my attention. The narrow food slot built into the steel door sat closed. Locked. Perfectly ordinary. Except for one detail. Someone had recently polished the metal around its hinges. The brushed steel reflected my flashlight, while the rest of the door remained dull with age. Fresh maintenance. Within days. Maybe hours. Yet according to every work order, no maintenance had been performed on cell 14 in decades. I crouched to examine the floor. Dust covered the concrete. Until it reached the door. There. The dust simply stopped. Not disturbed. Gone. As though invisible feet had worn away the surface over many years. I stood slowly. The hallway had become unnaturally quiet. No ventilation. No distant machinery. No footsteps. Only my own breathing. Then, a metallic click sounded from the other side of the door. Small. Careful. Exactly like someone gently setting down a spoon onto a steel tray. I waited. Nothing followed. No movement. No voices. No alarm. I checked my tablet. No inmate occupied the cell. I checked the electronic lock. Still secured. Then my radio crackled to life without warning. Not static. Not another officer. Just one calm voice I had never heard before. It spoke only 4 words. Dinner has been delivered. The transmission ended immediately. When I looked down at the base of cell 14, the food slot was still closed. But beneath it, lying neatly on the concrete where nothing had been a second earlier, was a warm stainless steel dinner tray. For several seconds, I simply stared at the tray. Steam drifted lazily from the mashed potatoes, curling into the cold air before disappearing. The smell of overcooked vegetables and institutional gravy mixed with the damp scent of concrete and old metal. My flashlight reflected softly off the stainless steel, making it look newer than anything else in Corridor D. I was certain of one thing. The tray hadn't been there a moment earlier. I had been looking directly at the base of the door. There had been nothing. Now there was dinner. Every instinct told me to open the inspection log and document the incident. Instead, training took over. First secure the area. Then verify the facts. I photographed the tray with my department-issued camera. Timestamp. Location. Temperature. Then I checked both ends of the corridor. No one. The security gate remained locked exactly where I had left it. Every maintenance room stood empty. My radio emitted only a faint layer of static before falling silent again. The tray was still warm. Far warmer than food should have been inside a hallway measuring 48 degrees. I knelt beside it. Roast chicken. Mashed potatoes. Green beans. 1 slice of bread. A sealed carton of milk. Exactly the same meal served to every inmate that evening. The only difference was the handwritten number on the napkin. 14. Not printed. Written with black marker. I carried the tray directly to Central Control. Officer Reynolds was supervising camera systems that night. He looked up as I entered. Kitchen shorted somebody? I found this. Where? Corridor D. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. You mean outside 14? I never said that. You didn't have to. He leaned back slowly. Leave it. Shouldn't we find out who put it there? It'll be handled. By who? It always is. I waited. He didn't elaborate. Instead, he opened a cabinet beneath the surveillance console, placed the tray inside without inspecting it, locked the cabinet, and returned the key to his pocket. The entire process lasted less than 30 seconds. Like he'd done it many times before. What happens to it now? I asked. Reynolds adjusted one of the monitors. You'll forget you brought it. I don't think I will. He looked at me for a long moment. I hope you do. The next morning, I requested access to historical occupancy records. Not because I expected to find anything extraordinary. Because I expected paperwork. Paperwork always leaves fingerprints. Even institutions built on secrecy need forms. The archive room occupied a quiet corner beneath administration. The air smelled of dry paper, dust, and aging electrical equipment. Old fluorescent tubes flickered overhead, while ventilation fans hummed behind metal grates. An elderly records clerk named Simmons greeted me without looking away from his filing cabinet. What year? I'm looking for cell 14. He stopped moving. Which year? Any. His shoulders tightened. We don't file that one. Why? No request code. I have authorization. No. He finally looked at me. You have authorization for prison records. He paused. The first time I heard someone breathing inside cell 14, the security camera showed an empty room. Not dark. Not obscured. Empty. The concrete bunk was bare. The stainless steel toilet reflected the overhead fluorescent light. The steel door remained locked exactly as it had been for decades, according to the maintenance log sitting open beside me. Yet through the speaker mounted beneath the monitor came slow, measured breaths. Not static. Not interference. Someone inhaling. Someone waiting. I checked the occupancy list twice. Every inmate had been accounted for after evening lockdown. Cell 14 had been listed as reserved every day for the last 50 years. Reserved for no one. The breathing stopped the moment I reached for the intercom. A second later, the camera flickered once. When the picture returned, there was a damp footprint on the floor beside the bunk. Just one. Nobody entered. Nobody left. The electronic lock had never disengaged. To this day, I still don't know why the oldest officers refused to look directly at that monitor after midnight. Or why every report I filed about Cell 14 disappeared before the next shift began. Most people imagine prisons as loud places. Movies teach you to expect shouting, metal doors slamming, fights, alarms, and endless chaos. The prison where I worked wasn't like that. It was quiet enough that you could hear snow hitting reinforced windows. Officially, the facility was called Blackridge Correctional Unit 7, although nobody ever used the full name. Staff simply called it Blackridge. It sat alone several hours from the nearest town, surrounded by dense pine forest and low mountains that stayed covered in fog for most of the year. The only road leading there climbed through narrow valleys where radio reception disappeared long before the prison came into view. By the time I accepted the transfer, I had already worked corrections for nearly 9 years. I wasn't looking for excitement. I wanted predictable shifts, better pay, and somewhere isolated enough to help me forget a difficult divorce. Remote institutions usually offered all three. The hiring interview barely lasted 20 minutes. The warden glanced over my personnel file. You've worked maximum security before. Yes. No disciplinary problems. No, sir. You follow procedure? I try to. He nodded once. Good. That was nearly the entire interview. No discussion about rehabilitation philosophy. No psychological evaluation beyond the standard forms. Just paperwork. 3 weeks later I arrived just before sunrise. The first thing I noticed wasn't the fences. It was the silence. Snow covered everything except the narrow roadway leading toward the outer gate. Wind drifted through rows of pine trees without much sound, carrying the faint smell of frozen earth and diesel fuel from the emergency generators somewhere behind the main buildings. The prison itself looked older than I expected. Gray concrete. Low rectangular housing blocks. Watchtowers positioned more for observation than intimidation. Nothing dramatic. Just functional. Cold. The main gate opened after 2 separate identity checks. Inside, another officer searched my vehicle more thoroughly than any prison I'd worked at before. They inspected beneath the seats. Removed my spare tire. Even counted my pens. I joked that someone must have escaped recently. The officer didn't smile. "We don't worry about people getting out." That answer stayed with me longer than it should have. Orientation lasted most of the morning. Assistant Warden Collins handled it personally. He walked quickly through narrow corridors illuminated by humming fluorescent fixtures that gave everything a pale green tint. The air smelled faintly of bleach, damp concrete, old paper, and industrial heating systems that struggled against the winter cold. Every hallway echoed differently. Some swallowed footsteps. Others carried them farther than seemed possible. Collins explained schedules. Meal counts. Medication procedures. Emergency codes. Equipment inventories. Everything sounded completely ordinary. Until we reached surveillance. "This room monitors every occupied housing unit." He pointed toward rows of screens. "Every occupied unit," he repeated. I noticed the wording immediately. "What about unoccupied ones?" He looked at me for half a second before answering. "Storage." Then he changed the subject. My assignment covered evening security inspections. Every 2 hours I walked designated routes through housing blocks B and C. Verify electronic locks. Inspect fire suppression equipment. Log temperature readings. Check maintenance requests. Compare inmate counts with electronic records. The work was repetitive. Honestly, I preferred that. Routine leaves less room for mistakes. My first several hours passed without incident. Most inmates ignored me. A few nodded politely. Veteran officers moved through their shifts with practiced efficiency, saying little beyond what was necessary. No unnecessary conversations. No gossip. No complaints. Just procedure. The entire place seemed built around routine. Almost ritual. Dinner ended shortly after 6. Snow continued falling outside, making the security lights glow against the fog beyond the perimeter fence. By 7, visibility outside the watchtowers had dropped to less than 50 yards. The weather radio produced occasional bursts of static before returning to forecasts no one seemed interested in hearing. Around 8:30 I met Officer Morales in the equipment room. He had worked at Blackridge for over 20 years. Gray hair. Calm voice. Never appeared rushed. He signed out a flashlight before looking at me. "First week?" "First day. You'll settle in. So far it seems quieter than I expected." "It usually is." He hesitated. "Stay ahead on your paperwork." "I always do." "And don't invent extra work." "I don't follow." He simply shrugged. "If something doesn't involve you, leave it alone." That struck me as odd advice inside a prison. Questions usually kept people alive. Before I could ask what he meant, another officer entered, and the conversation ended. My first independent patrol started at 10. The corridors felt different at night. The overhead ventilation produced a steady mechanical vibration that traveled through the walls. The heating pipes clicked every few minutes as pressure changed. Occasionally distant footsteps echoed from somewhere impossible to judge. I logged temperatures. Checked locks. Verified emergency exits. Everything matched procedure. Until I reached Corridor D. Unlike the occupied housing units, this hallway held only 6 cells. 5 stood open. Empty. Maintenance supplies filled 2. Old filing cabinets occupied another. One contained damaged furniture waiting for disposal. The final door remained shut. A brass plate beside it read, "Cell 14. No inmate identification card." No electronic name display. Just the number. I checked my tablet. No assignment listed. No maintenance order. No record at all. The silence around that corridor felt unusually complete. Even the ventilation sounded quieter there. A faint metallic smell lingered in the cool air. Not blood. Not rust exactly. Just old steel after years of winter humidity. I walked closer. The electronic lock displayed green. Operational. The inspection window had been covered from the inside with a solid steel shutter. That wasn't standard. I wrote a note to ask maintenance about it later. As I turned to leave, Morales appeared at the far end of the corridor. He hadn't made a sound approaching. You finished? Almost. I pointed toward the sealed door. What's inside 14? He looked at the number without changing expression. Then he answered so quietly I almost missed it. Nothing. He continued walking. I looked back once more at the door. Nothing about it appeared unusual anymore. Just another reinforced steel entrance inside another aging prison. Still, as I resumed my patrol, I realized something that hadn't registered before. Every cell in Corridor D had accumulated a thin layer of dust near the thresholds. Every cell. Except cell 14. Someone, or something, had been disturbing the floor recently. But according to every record I'd seen, no one had occupied that cell for 50 years. By the end of my first week, I could tell time without looking at a clock. Not because I had memorized the schedule. Because Blackridge had its own rhythm. At 5:30 every morning, the boilers shuddered awake beneath the administration building, sending a dull vibration through the concrete floors. 5 minutes later the ventilation system changed pressure with a long, hollow sigh that echoed through every corridor. At 6 sharp, fluorescent lights snapped on in the housing units with a faint electrical buzz that seemed louder during winter. Breakfast carts rolled across polished concrete exactly 12 minutes later, their metal wheels clicking over expansion joints in the floor. Every sound happened when it was supposed to. Every officer moved according to procedure. Every inmate followed the routine because routine was easier than resistance. The predictability was comforting. Until I realized one part of the prison followed a different schedule. Corridor D. No one was ever assigned there. Yet every morning, just before shift change, someone unlocked its security gate. I knew because the electronic access log recorded it. I also knew something else. Nobody's identification card appeared beside the entry. The door simply opened. Then closed. Every day. Without recording who entered. My responsibilities became almost automatic. Inspect electronic locks. Confirm inmate counts. Log temperatures in each housing unit. Test emergency radios. Check sprinkler valves. Verify camera alignment. Sign maintenance reports. The repetition should have dulled my curiosity. Instead, it sharpened it. When you spend enough hours inside a prison, you notice the smallest deviations. A light bulb that burns brighter than yesterday. A vent that hums at a different pitch. A cart left facing the wrong direction. The mind begins organizing patterns without permission. That was how Cell 14 kept finding its way back into my thoughts. It never appeared on inspection schedules. Never appeared on maintenance requests. Never appeared during staff briefings. And yet everyone behaved as though it mattered. Just not in a way anyone was willing to discuss. One evening, I asked Officer Daniels about Corridor D while we inventoried emergency medical kits. Daniels had transferred from another state facility 2 years earlier. Unlike Morales, he still complained about the isolation. You ever been down there? I asked. He kept counting bandages. Where? D corridor. He looked up for only a second. I stay where my assignment tells me. That wasn't my question. No. His answer came too quickly. Then he zipped the medical bag closed. Listen. He lowered his voice. You'll hear people joke about ghosts in old prisons. I'm not really the ghost type. Good. He nodded once. Neither are the people who stop asking questions. Before I could respond, he lifted the supply case and walked away. It wasn't fear in his voice. It sounded more like exhaustion. The weather continued getting worse. Heavy snow buried the outer fences until only the upper layers of razor wire remained visible beneath floodlights. Strong winds rattled the observation towers through the night, carrying loose ice across the concrete yards with a dry scraping sound. The prison felt even more isolated than before. Supply deliveries became less frequent. Radio reception faded in and out. Satellite internet disconnected almost every evening. No one seemed bothered. The older staff joked that Blackridge always preferred being left alone during winter. I wasn't sure whether they meant the prison or something else. On my 9th night, I noticed another irregularity. At exactly 11:47 p.m., every officer in Housing Block C stopped moving for nearly 5 seconds. Not intentionally. Not dramatically. They simply paused. One officer froze halfway through signing paperwork. Another stood beside a security door without touching the keypad. A nurse stopped pushing a medication cart. Even 2 inmates visible through observation windows stood silently inside their cells. Then, everything resumed. No alarms. No announcement. No explanation. The interruption lasted only moments. I looked around, expecting someone else to mention it. Nobody did. The hallway returned to normal as though nothing had happened. I checked my watch. The second hand had continued moving. I checked the surveillance monitors. Video playback showed no interruption at all. Every camera displayed uninterrupted motion. Except one. Camera D4. The monitor covering cell 14. For those same 5 seconds, its timestamp disappeared. Just blank space beneath an otherwise normal image of an empty corridor. The following afternoon I searched archived maintenance reports during a slow period. Officially, I was looking for replacement records involving damaged surveillance wiring. Unofficially, I wanted to know who maintained Corridor D. The records made no sense. Every electrical inspection ended one door before cell 14. Cleaning logs skipped it entirely. Fire inspections listed the corridor. Then marked one line as not applicable. Maintenance diagrams showed plumbing reaching every cell except one. Cell 14 wasn't omitted. It was deliberately blank, as though the room had been erased from the building plans after construction. I printed one copy before the archive terminal unexpectedly restarted itself. When the system came back online, the document no longer existed. Not deleted. Simply absent. Even the file number had disappeared. Later that evening, I found Morales drinking stale coffee beside the surveillance room. Outside, freezing rain tapped softly against reinforced windows while distant wind moaned around the watchtower supports. Inside, warm air from the heating ducts carried the smell of dust and old wiring. He noticed the folded blueprint sticking from my notebook. "You've been reading things. I've been doing my job. Those aren't always the same. I found missing records." "No." He shook his head slowly. "You found records that learned how to disappear." I laughed. He didn't. After several seconds of silence, he spoke again. "Every prison has stories." "I know. Most of them grow bigger every year. And this one? This one gets smaller." "What does that mean?" "Not those records." Before I could ask another question, he slid a blank request form across the counter. Our conversation never happened. That afternoon, a snowstorm buried the access road completely. Maintenance crews spent hours clearing drifts away from the outer security fence while freezing wind howled through the razor wire. I struck observation tower windows with tiny sharp clicks that echoed faintly across the yard. The weather report predicted another 48 hours before conditions improved. Nobody complained. Blackridge had supplies for months. Isolation was normal here. During evening briefing, Assistant Warden Collins reviewed routine security updates. Generator fuel. Medical inventory. Weather advisories. Then he reached the final page. If anyone receives unauthorized radio traffic during patrol. He glanced around the room. Ignore it. No explanation. No discussion. The meeting continued. I noticed something else. Not one veteran officer appeared surprised. That night, I tested my radio. Channel 1. Normal. Channel 2. Maintenance. Channel 3. Medical. Everything functioned perfectly. Then, at exactly 11:47 p.m., the speaker produced a brief burst of static. The same second, every hallway seemed to lose its usual background noise. The ventilation stopped. Heating pipes became silent. Even the distant generator vibration disappeared. 5 seconds. Exactly 5. When sound returned, I checked my watch. Still running. I checked my body camera. Still recording. I checked my radio log. No transmission. Nothing unusual. Except the digital clock inside Corridor D now read 11:46. 1 minute earlier than every other clock in the prison. I returned the following evening with a maintenance thermometer, determined to verify the temperature anomaly. 47 degrees. 1 degree colder than before. Humidity. Normal. Airflow. Almost non-existent. The hallway carried a faint smell of wet stone, despite there being no visible moisture anywhere nearby. I inspected every vent. Nothing. Every light fixture. Normal. Every camera housing. Operational. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Except the cameras. They all faced slightly away from cell 14. Not enough for casual observation. Barely noticeable. Just a few degrees. Almost as if someone had adjusted them to avoid looking directly at the door. Curiosity finally overcame caution. I walked into central control after midnight. No one else occupied the room. Rows of monitors filled one wall, casting pale blue light across desks cluttered with incident reports and coffee cups. Camera D4 displayed the familiar image of Corridor D. Empty. I selected playback. Rewound 1 hour. Nothing unusual. Rewound another. Still nothing. Then I noticed something strange. Every recording skipped exactly 8 seconds whenever anyone passed cell 14. Not corrupted. Not distorted. Simply absent. One frame showed an officer approaching. The next showed him already beyond the door. 8 seconds gone. Every patrol. Every officer. Every day. I checked another date. Same thing. Another month. Again. Years of recordings. Always 8 missing seconds. Always the same location. Always cell 14. Unable to ignore it any longer, I searched physical archives instead of digital ones. Old maintenance binders occupied shelves no one had touched in years. Dust coated the covers thick enough to leave fingerprints. Page after page documented plumbing repairs, electrical upgrades, roof inspections, repainting schedules. Then I found a binder dated 1976. Halfway through, someone had removed nearly every page. Only one remained. It wasn't a maintenance report. It was a handwritten inspection checklist. The ink had faded brown with age. Most of the form was illegible. Only 3 lines could still be read. Occupant status, present. Meal delivery, continue. Door access, never open. There was no inmate name. No identification number. Only one signature. Unfortunately, someone had carefully cut away the bottom of the page where the signature should have been. Sleep became difficult after that. Not because I felt frightened. Because my thoughts refused to stay organized. Every logical explanation collapsed into another contradiction. If cell 14 had been empty for 50 years, who required meals? Why did historical paperwork describe an occupant? Why erase the records but preserve the procedures? Most importantly, who was still following them? 3 nights later, I completed my patrol earlier than usual. The prison felt unusually still. Snow had stopped falling, leaving the grounds wrapped in heavy fog that pressed against exterior floodlights. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly while distant machinery vibrated somewhere beneath the floor. As I approached Corridor D, I noticed the security gate already standing open. I was certain I had locked it 30 minutes earlier. No entry appeared in the electronic access log. No alarm indicated forced access. I drew my flashlight. Advanced carefully. Every maintenance room remained empty. Every light still burned steadily. The air felt colder than ever. Then I saw it. The inspection shutter covering cell 14's viewing window was open. Only by an inch. Just enough to expose complete darkness beyond the reinforced glass. Someone, or something, had opened it from the inside. And before I could decide whether to step closer, a tired male voice whispered through the narrow opening. Quiet. Calm. As though continuing a conversation that had begun years ago. You're late tonight. I didn't answer. For a few seconds, I wasn't even sure I had actually heard the voice. The corridor remained perfectly still. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, giving the concrete walls a pale green cast. Cold air settled heavily around my boots, carrying the faint smell of wet cement and industrial disinfectant. Somewhere beyond the housing units, a ventilation fan groaned before falling silent again. I stood motionless. Waiting. Nothing else came from behind the inspection window. No breathing. No movement. No second sentence. Just silence. Slowly, I stepped closer until I was less than 2 feet from the steel door. The inspection shutter had definitely been lifted from the inside. There was no exterior handle. No maintenance latch. Nothing I could have manipulated myself. Only a narrow opening exposing reinforced security glass. Beyond it, darkness. Not the ordinary darkness of an unlit room. It looked strangely complete, as though the beam from my flashlight stopped at the glass instead of passing through it. I angled the light. Nothing. Not even the outline of the concrete bunk that should have been visible. It was like shining a flashlight into deep water. The light simply disappeared. Then the radio on my shoulder crackled. Officer Hale. It was Morales. His voice sounded unusually tense. Report your location. I hesitated. Corridor D. A pause. Then. Leave. I think someone's inside. Another pause. Longer this time. Finally he replied. I know exactly where you are. The transmission ended. Procedure demanded that I report unusual inmate activity. Procedure also required visual confirmation before declaring an occupied cell. I had neither. Only a voice. Only darkness. Only uncertainty. I lowered the inspection shutter carefully until it clicked shut. Immediately, the corridor felt different. Not warmer. Not brighter. Just normal. The ventilation resumed its low mechanical hum. Somewhere down the hallway, water moved through old pipes with a familiar metallic rattle. The feeling that someone was standing inches away from the other side of the door faded almost instantly. I hated how relieved I felt. The following morning I requested architectural plans for Blackridge. Officially, I claimed I needed them to verify emergency evacuation routes. No one questioned the request. Facilities management occupied a small office beneath the boiler room. The air there was warmer than the rest of the prison, thick with the smell of machine oil, hot copper pipes, and aging insulation. Compressors vibrated steadily through the floor while old filing cabinets lined one wall. The supervisor, a quiet woman named Peters, unlocked a flat storage drawer containing the original construction blueprints. The prison had been built in phases. The oldest wing dated back to the early 1950s. Corridor D belonged to that original structure. I spread the drawings across the drafting table. Housing Block A. Block B. Medical. Kitchen. Administration. Everything matched the modern layout. Then I reached Corridor D. Cells 10 through 13 appeared exactly where they should. Cell 15 and Cell 16 followed. Between them, nothing. No Cell 14. No empty space. No utility shaft. The numbering simply skipped from 13 to 15. I checked another revision. Same result. Another copy. Again. Yet I had personally stood in front of a steel door marked 14. Something wrong? Peters had returned carrying maintenance invoices. I pointed to the blueprint. Where's 14? She looked at the page for less than a second. There isn't one. I've seen it. No. She folded the drawing closed. You've seen a door. The distinction caught me off guard. Before I could ask what she meant, she returned the blueprints to storage. Our office doesn't keep obsolete layouts. These are the original plans. They're the only plans. That evening I stopped by the prison library. Most correctional facilities maintain legal references and educational materials for inmates. Blackridge also kept historical newspapers from nearby counties. I wasn't searching for ghost stories. I wanted construction reports. Old prisons leave paper trails. After nearly an hour, I found an article dated October 1976. Remote prison expansion completed. The accompanying photograph showed the administration building surrounded by fresh concrete. Workers stood smiling beside the new housing wing. Behind them, Corridor D, visible through an open doorway. I leaned closer. The photograph clearly showed 6 cell doors. Numbers 10. Exactly like the blueprints. No 14. I turned the page. A small correction notice had been stapled beneath the article some time later. Most of the text had faded. Only one sentence remained readable. Following the incident, all references have been updated accordingly. No explanation. No mention of what incident. No date. Someone had removed the remainder with a razor blade. By now, I had begun noticing another pattern. Whenever anyone mentioned cell 14, conversations ended. Not gradually. Immediately. Lunch breaks. Shift changes. Equipment inspections. The room simply became quiet. Even inmates behaved strangely. One older prisoner, serving a life sentence, watched me during evening medication rounds. As I passed his cell, he spoke without looking up. You've been walking the old hallway. I stopped. Which hallway? The one people pretend isn't there. Before I could ask another question, another inmate called for medication. When I looked back, the old man had already stepped away from the door. He never spoke to me again. 3 days later, my curiosity outweighed my judgment. Every prison maintains restricted storage areas. Blackridge had one beneath administration. Access required supervisor approval. Fortunately, inventory audits were part of my monthly responsibilities. The basement smelled of damp cardboard, rust, and stale air trapped for decades. Water dripped somewhere behind concrete walls with slow, irregular echoes. Exposed pipes ran overhead, wrapped in cracked insulation that shed fine white dust whenever the heating system cycled. Rows of metal shelves disappeared into darkness. Old uniforms. Retired radios. Broken surveillance equipment. Archived security logs. Near the back stood a locked cage marked "Property, do not destroy." Inside were dozens of sealed evidence boxes. Most carried dates from the 1970s. One box had no inventory label. Only a faded strip of masking tape. Written across it in black marker. D14. The padlock had already been cut years earlier. I opened the lid. Inside rested only 3 objects. A ring of old brass keys. A cracked cassette recorder. And a leather-bound incident notebook. The notebook belonged to Lieutenant Samuel Archer, shift supervisor, Blackridge Correctional Unit. Most pages had been removed. The remaining entries became increasingly fragmented. At first they described routine inspections, generator maintenance, prison counts, staff shortages. Then the handwriting changed. Shorter sentences. Messier. One entry read, "Meal delivered again. Door remains sealed." Another. "Camera recorded empty cell. Officer insists someone answered." Several pages later. "Recommendation denied. Continue existing procedure." The final intact page contained only one line. Written so hard the pen nearly tore through the paper. "The cell is occupied because we keep treating it like it is." No explanation followed. The remaining pages had been ripped away. That sentence lingered in my mind for the rest of the night. Occupied because we keep treating it like it is. It sounded impossible. Almost philosophical. Yet every procedure I had witnessed supported it. Meals continued arriving. Records continued disappearing. Officers continued avoiding the subject. Routine itself seemed to preserve something no one acknowledged. Near midnight, I returned to Central Control. No one noticed me reviewing archived surveillance footage. This time I wasn't watching the corridor. I watched the officers. Every night. Every shift. Whoever walked past cell 14 unconsciously slowed down. Some briefly glanced toward the door. Others looked deliberately away. But one detail repeated without exception. Each officer touched the brim of their cap. Exactly 3 steps before reaching the cell. Not a salute. Not a scratch. Just 2 fingers against the cap. Then they continued walking. None of them appeared aware they were doing it. I checked recordings spanning 15 years. The gesture never changed. New recruits. Veterans. Supervisors. Everyone. Even me. My stomach tightened. I rewound footage from my own first patrol. There I was. Walking towards cell 14. Hands occupied with my inspection tablet. Flashlight in my left hand. Nothing unusual. Then, without breaking stride, my right hand lifted. 2 fingers touched the brim of my cap. I never remembered doing it. Never felt myself move. Yet the recording showed it clearly. I stared at the monitor until the timestamp advanced to my current shift. The live camera now showed Corridor D exactly as I had left it. Empty. Cold. Silent. Then, without warning, every monitor in Central Control flickered once. Only once. When the picture returned. Camera D4 was no longer showing the corridor. It was showing the inside of cell 14. The room was empty. The bunk was bare. The overhead light was off. But in the far corner of the room, someone had placed a second stainless steel dinner tray. Still steaming. And before I could call for anyone else to see it, the screen switched back to the corridor by itself. As if the prison had just shown me something it immediately regretted. I told no one about what I had seen on the monitor. Not because I doubted myself. Because I already knew what would happen. The footage would disappear. The report would vanish. Someone would quietly remind me to focus on my assigned duties. That had become the pattern at Blackridge. The prison never argued with you. It simply erased the evidence until you began arguing with yourself. For the first time since arriving, I started carrying a small notebook in my uniform pocket. Not an official incident log. A personal one. Every unusual event. Every missing minute. Every strange conversation. Every temperature reading. If something disappeared from the prison's records, I wanted my own copy. I wrote the date at the top of the first page. Before the week ended, I had filled nearly half the notebook. The weather turned warmer for less than a day. Snow melted from the rooftops, dripping steadily onto the concrete walkways between the housing blocks. Fog rolled low across the prison yard, swallowing the perimeter fences until the floodlights looked like pale circles floating in empty air. The dampness carried the smell of wet pine and rust, while water echoed through storm drains beneath the complex. Everyone seemed more tired. Officers forgot small things. Keys left indoors. Reports signed twice. Radio batteries left uncharged. Nothing serious. Just enough mistakes to suggest poor sleep. During lunch, I overheard 2 nurses discussing the same dream. Neither realized the other had experienced it. I kept hearing someone counting. How high? I don't know. Mine stopped at 14. The room fell silent. Neither woman spoke again. I had stopped believing in coincidences. That evening, I checked my notebook before beginning patrol. The previous page contained an entry I didn't remember writing. The handwriting was mine. The ink matched my pen. Yet I had no memory of making it. It read, "Don't stand directly in front of the door." Nothing else. No explanation. No time. I stared at the sentence for nearly a minute. The letters looked slightly shaky, as though written by someone exhausted. I flipped through earlier pages. Everything else was familiar. Only that single line felt borrowed. At 10:18 p.m., I reached Corridor D. The temperature had dropped again. 45 degrees. A thin layer of condensation covered the lower half of the concrete walls, reflecting the fluorescent lights in dull patches. The air felt heavier than usual, almost difficult to breathe, carrying a metallic smell mixed with something faintly organic, like wet paper left in a basement for years. The corridor was empty. I checked every lock, every maintenance room, every emergency panel. Nothing unusual. Until I reached cell 14. The brass number plate had changed. Not physically. I mean, it looked older. The polished edges I remembered from my first week had become dark with age. Tiny scratches crossed the surface. The screws holding it in place showed fresh corrosion. I reached out and touched the metal. Cold. Very cold. Almost painfully so. When I looked down, my notebook was lying open in my left hand. I hadn't taken it out. The newest page now contained another sentence. Do not answer if it knows your name. I closed the notebook immediately. My pulse finally began to quicken. The rest of my patrol passed without incident. Or so I believed. Back in the staff locker room, I removed my body camera and connected it to the upload terminal. While waiting for the transfer, I reviewed the footage. Everything matched my memory. Housing Block B. Medication rounds. Equipment checks. Corridor D. Then, the recording reached cell 14. The image froze for less than a second. When playback resumed, I was standing directly in front of the inspection window. My face only inches from the glass. Motionless. The timestamp showed 10:23 p.m. 5 minutes had passed. I remembered none of them. The video contained no audio during that interval. Only silence. I watched myself standing there. Not moving. Not blinking. At 10:28, I suddenly stepped backward, looked around in visible confusion, and resumed my patrol. Exactly as I remembered. Except 5 entire minutes no longer belonged to me. The upload terminal displayed an error. File corrupted. When I attempted a second upload, those 5 minutes had disappeared completely. The video jumped from 10:22 to 10:28. As though they had never existed. Sleep became almost impossible after that. Every night I dreamed about routine. Not monsters. Not prisons. Routine. Walking corridors. Checking locks. Signing paperwork. Then realizing I had repeated the same hallway dozens of times without noticing. Sometimes I woke convinced I was still wearing my uniform. Once I reached for my radio before remembering I was home. Another morning I found my boots neatly cleaned despite never touching them the previous evening. I lived alone. There was no one else in the apartment. The following week, Assistant Warden Collins stopped me outside administration. You look tired. Not sleeping well. Nobody does at first. At first? He ignored the question. Instead, he handed me a revised patrol schedule. I glanced down. Corridor D had been removed from my assignment. I thought I was responsible for inspections. You are. It says otherwise. It says what it needs to. He walked away before I could respond. That night, I inspected Corridor D anyway. The hallway felt different. Not colder. Quieter. The ventilation had resumed normal operation, yet the echoes seemed strangely delayed. Each footstep returned a fraction of a second later than it should have, as though the corridor had become slightly longer while I wasn't looking. I tested the distance with my flashlight. Same dimensions. Same walls. Same doors. Still, something felt subtly wrong. Then I noticed the clocks. A digital maintenance clock hung above the security gate. 10:34. My wristwatch. 10:34. The wall clock outside Corridor C. 10:34. Perfect. I walked towards cell 14. Halfway there, the maintenance clock behind me chimed once. I turned. It now read 10:33. 1 minute earlier. My wristwatch still showed 10:34. The prison clock had gone backward. Not reset. Not flickered. Simply backward. I hurried to central control. Every system clock there matched my watch. No discrepancy. No error report. No maintenance alert. Reynolds looked up from his paperwork. You look like you've seen something. I think one of the clocks malfunctioned. Which one? Corridor D. He nodded slowly. They usually do. Usually? When people pay attention. I waited for him to explain. He returned to his paperwork. Conversation over. Later that night, while completing temperature logs, I discovered another inconsistency. Every hallway measured within normal range. Except Corridor D. 45 degrees. Exactly. No variation. Not 44.9. Not 45.1. Exactly 45. Every reading. Every hour. My thermometer wasn't broken. I verified it elsewhere. Only Corridor D refused to change. As though the temperature itself had become part of the routine. Around midnight, a winter storm struck unexpectedly. Wind hammered the prison walls with low, sustained pressure. Ice rattled against reinforced windows while emergency generators vibrated beneath the floors. Visibility outside dropped almost to zero as dense snow swirled through the floodlights. Power flickered. Emergency lights activated. For less than 3 seconds, the prison was illuminated only by dim red backup lighting. When normal power returned, every occupied cell remained exactly as before. Except one monitor. Camera D4. It no longer showed Corridor D. It showed a man. Standing inside cell 14. His back faced the camera. Gray correctional uniform. Old style. 1970s issue. Hands folded calmly behind him. He wasn't moving. Neither was the camera. I leaned closer to the screen. There was something familiar about the way he stood. The posture. The shoulders. The slight tilt of his head. Then the image sharpened. The embroidered name stitched across the back of the uniform became readable. Not completely. Only the first 4 letters. Hale. My last name. Before I could process what I was seeing, the emergency lights flickered once more. The monitor returned to its usual view of the empty corridor. I checked the recording immediately. No trace of the image remained. But when I reached into my pocket for the notebook, a page had been folded neatly in half. I was certain it hadn't been before. Inside, written in my own handwriting, were 6 words I had never written. By the middle of February, I stopped trying to separate my job from whatever was happening around cell 14. At Blackridge, the two had become impossible to untangle. The prison functioned because people followed procedures. The strange things surrounding Corridor D also seemed to function because people followed procedures. No one spoke openly about it. No one admitted believing anything unusual. Yet everyone, especially the officers who had worked there the longest, performed small, precise actions that never appeared in any official manual. None of them seemed aware they were doing it. Or perhaps they simply refused to acknowledge it. Either possibility bothered me equally. My notebook had become my only reliable reference. Every morning before leaving for work, I compared the previous day's entries with my memories. Most matched perfectly. Some didn't. A few pages contained details I remembered only after reading them. Twice I found entire paragraphs describing conversations that I had completely forgotten. The handwriting remained unmistakably mine. The wording sounded like me. But the memories arrived only after I saw the ink. It felt less like remembering, and more like being reminded. One evening I arrived 40 minutes early for my shift. The administration building was unusually quiet. Outside, freezing rain coated the prison yard with a thin layer of ice that reflected the floodlights in pale yellow streaks. The air carried the smell of wet pine and diesel exhaust from the backup generators, while wind pushed fine mist against the reinforced windows with a soft, constant hiss. Most officers gathered in the break room before briefing. Coffee. Paperwork. Routine complaints. Nothing remarkable. Until Morales entered. He looked more tired than I had ever seen him. His uniform remained perfectly pressed, but the skin beneath his eyes had darkened noticeably. He poured himself coffee without speaking. After several minutes, he asked quietly, "How long have you been keeping notes?" The question caught me completely off guard. I never mentioned notes. You didn't have to. I didn't answer. He took one slow sip. When I started here. He stared into the cup. I kept one too. That surprised me more than anything he'd ever said. What happened to it? I burned it. Why? It wouldn't stay finished. I felt my stomach tighten. What does that mean? He finally looked at me. I'd throw it away. Then? It came back. Neither of us spoke for several moments. The heating system clicked somewhere overhead as pressure shifted through old pipes. Someone laughed in another room before the sound faded into the usual mechanical hum of the building. Finally I asked, "Why does everyone pretend Cell 14 doesn't exist?" Morales considered the question carefully. Then he answered with one of his own. "Have you ever wondered why every officer here works alone after dark?" I nodded. "It's more efficient." "No." He shook his head. "It keeps us from comparing memories." Before I could ask what he meant, briefing began. He never returned to the subject. That sentence stayed with me throughout the night. Keeping us from comparing memories. I began paying closer attention to shift changes. Normally, officers exchanged only essential information. Equipment status. Maintenance issues. Medical concerns. Nothing personal. Nothing detailed. No one ever asked another officer, "How was your patrol?" I had never noticed that before. The question simply didn't exist at Blackridge. Around 10:30 I received an unexpected assignment. Escort a maintenance technician to Corridor D. The request came directly from facilities. It was the first official work order involving that hallway since my arrival. The technician introduced himself as Ellis. Late 60s. Quiet. Hands rough from decades of repair work. He pushed a small tool cart loaded with electrical equipment. Neither of us spoke much as we walked. The corridor felt unusually damp. Condensation gathered along the lower concrete walls while cold air drifted steadily beneath the ceiling vents. Somewhere inside the building, unseen machinery vibrated with a slow, rhythmic pulse that almost resembled a heartbeat. Ellis stopped 50 feet from Cell 14. "That's close enough. The work order says lighting inspection." "It does. Aren't we inspecting it?" "No." He removed a screwdriver from his cart. Then, instead of approaching the hallway lights, he knelt beside a small steel access panel built into the floor. I had never noticed it before. He unlocked the panel using an old brass key. Inside were 3 switches. None carried labels. Ellis flipped the middle switch upward. Waited exactly 10 seconds. Flipped it back down. Locked the panel. "Done." I stared at him. "What did you repair?" "The schedule." "That's not an answer." "It wasn't supposed to be." As we turned to leave, I looked back towards Cell 14. Something had changed. Not the door. The light above it. For the first time since arriving, the fluorescent fixture directly outside the cell had stopped humming. The silence around the doorway felt unnaturally complete. Ellis noticed me looking. "Don't stop." "Why?" "Because it notices when people stop." Those words settled over me like the cold itself. We continued walking. Neither of us looked back again. The following afternoon I found Lieutenant Archer's notebook missing from the evidence storage cage. No sign-out sheet. No transfer paperwork. The box remained exactly where I had left it. Only the notebook had disappeared. Inside the empty box rested a single folded envelope. No address. No stamp. Only my last name written neatly across the front. Hale. The handwriting looked decades old. I opened it carefully. Inside lay one yellowed sheet of paper. Typed. Not handwritten. The heading read, Supplemental Night Procedures. Below it appeared 6 numbered instructions. Deliver meals at scheduled times. Never acknowledge voices after midnight. Never verify occupancy. Correct all records immediately. Maintain normal routine. If Procedure 6 becomes necessary, no written report is required. There was no Procedure 6. The page ended there, as though the final instruction had been deliberately removed. I checked every archive. No additional pages. No appendix. Nothing. Only 6 lines. One of which referred to another instruction that didn't exist. That night, curiosity overcame every remaining ounce of professional caution. I decided to watch the veterans instead of the cell. If there was a hidden system, someone had to be maintaining it. At 11:40 p.m., I positioned myself inside central control. Every monitor covering Corridor D remained visible. Officer Reynolds entered exactly 6 minutes later. Without speaking, he unlocked a cabinet beneath the surveillance desk. Removed a stainless steel dinner tray. The same kind I had discovered weeks earlier. Covered with a white cloth. He carried it calmly toward Corridor D. No escort. No paperwork. No radio call. I followed at a distance, keeping far enough back that he wouldn't hear my footsteps. The hallway felt colder than ever. 45 degrees. Exactly. Reynolds stopped outside cell 14. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He simply crouched. Opened the food slot. Slid the tray inside. Closed it. Locked it. The entire process lasted perhaps 15 seconds. Then, he stood perfectly still. Head slightly lowered. Waiting. The prison around us had become utterly silent. No ventilation. No pipes. No wind. Nothing. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then a faint metallic sound came from inside the cell. A spoon. Gently touching a tray. Reynolds nodded once. Turned around. Walked away. As though everything had gone exactly as expected. I remained hidden until he disappeared. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it inside my ears. The hallway remained silent. I stepped toward the cell. The food slot had already been locked. No light escaped beneath the door. No voices. Nothing. I placed my hand carefully against the steel. It wasn't cold anymore. It was warm. Body temperature. Almost comforting. Then, from the other side, someone knocked. Not loudly. 3 slow taps. Exactly matching the rhythm I had absent-mindedly used on my apartment door my entire adult life. A habit I had never shared with anyone. My hand jerked away instinctively. The knocking stopped. I backed away. One careful step at a time. Then another. Halfway down the corridor, my radio came alive. No static. No call sign. Only Assistant Warden Collins. His voice sounded calm. Almost sympathetic. Officer Hale. I answered immediately. Go ahead. A long pause followed. Then he asked one question. One that made every hair on my arms stand up. Why are you standing outside a cell that doesn't exist? For several seconds, I couldn't answer Collins. My radio remained warm against my shoulder, emitting only the faint hiss of an open channel. The corridor around me was perfectly still. Cold air lingered at ankle height, while the fluorescent light above cell 14 buzzed softly for the first time in weeks, as if something inside the prison had quietly resumed breathing. Finally, I managed to speak. I'm outside Corridor D. No. Collins answered immediately. You're outside medical storage. I looked up. The brass number on the door still read 14. The concrete walls hadn't changed. The maintenance rooms remained exactly where they had always been. I think you're looking at the wrong map, I said. Another pause. Then Collins replied in the same calm voice. Officer Hale. You've been standing still for 23 minutes. The transmission ended. 23 minutes. I checked my watch. 12:07 a.m. The last time I had looked at it, it had been 11:44. I remembered every second between those times. Or at least I thought I did. Walking. Listening to the knocks. Speaking into the radio. None of it felt 23 minutes long. I hurried back towards Central Control. The farther I walked from Corridor D, the warmer the prison became. The familiar sounds returned one after another. Ventilation. Heating pipes. Distant footsteps. A rolling meal cart somewhere in housing Block B. It was like emerging from underwater. Reynolds looked up as I entered. You all right? I just lost 20 minutes. He frowned. You're early. What? You came back faster than I expected. I stared at the wall clock. 11:49 p.m. I looked at my wristwatch. 12:07. Neither of us was joking. Neither clock changed. Both continued counting forward. At different times. I borrowed another officer's watch. 11:49. The control room computer. 11:49. Security server. 11:49. Only my watch insisted it was after midnight. Without saying another word, I removed it and placed it on the desk. The second hand continued moving. Reynolds glanced at it. You should probably throw that away. It's department issued. I know. He slid it back toward me. So was mine. I never asked what he meant. Part of me no longer wanted answers. Because every answer inside Blackridge created a new contradiction. The next several days blurred together. Not dramatically. Quietly. Routine became strangely unreliable. I would begin inspecting housing Block C. Then suddenly find myself signing paperwork in administration with no memory of walking there. I would finish lunch, only to discover my coffee had already gone cold beside a report I didn't remember writing. No one else appeared concerned. Whenever I apologized for forgetting something, another officer would simply nod. Happens. That single word became the most common response in the prison. Happens. As though memory itself was another piece of equipment that occasionally malfunctioned. My notebook became increasingly disturbing. Every morning new entries appeared. Not many. 1 or 2 sentences. Always in my handwriting. Always describing events before they happened. The western hallway will smell like smoke tonight. It did. Morales will ask if you've slept. He did. Don't mention the clocks today. I didn't. Not because I chose not to. Because by the time anyone spoke to me, I had already forgotten intending to. Eventually, I began testing myself. Each morning I folded a blank sheet of paper and placed it inside my uniform pocket. Nothing written. Nothing hidden. At the end of every shift, there were words. Sometimes only one. Wait. Sometimes a warning. It isn't following you. You're following it. Once. Only a time. 11:47. No explanation. Always my handwriting. Sleep deprivation finally began affecting my judgment. Not in obvious ways. I wasn't hallucinating. I wasn't seeing monsters. Instead, small certainties disappeared. I could no longer remember which key opened my apartment. I forgot my own phone number while filling out paperwork. Driving home one morning, I missed the highway exit I'd taken for years. I didn't realize it until 20 miles later. The frightening part wasn't forgetting. It was how ordinary forgetting felt. One evening I found Morales sitting alone in the empty staff cafeteria. Outside, freezing fog drifted across the prison yard, reducing visibility until the watchtowers looked like faded silhouettes against the darkness. Inside, the cafeteria lights reflected off polished tables while industrial refrigerators hummed steadily behind the serving line. The smell of burnt coffee lingered in the warm air. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. He gestured toward the empty chair across from him. You've started losing names. I froze. I never told anyone that. You don't have to. He rubbed his eyes. That's when it gets difficult. You've been through this. He gave a tired smile. We all have. What happened? We stayed. The answer sounded almost like regret. I leaned forward. Tell me what Cell 14 really is. Morales remained silent for so long that I assumed he wouldn't answer. Finally he spoke. When I arrived. He paused. There were 19 officers on nights. I counted 12. There are 12. What happened to the others? He looked toward the cafeteria windows. I don't remember. His voice cracked slightly. And that's what scares me. That sentence echoed through my thoughts for hours. Not remembering someone dying was one thing. Not remembering someone existing was something else entirely. Near the end of my shift, I visited the staff memorial wall. Every prison has one. Photographs of retired officers. Plaques honoring those who died in service. Blackridge's wall stretched nearly 30 feet. Dozens of names. Faces spanning decades. I examined every photograph carefully. One frame near the end caught my attention. The glass had been removed. Only 4 screw holes remained. A small brass plaque underneath read, Lt. Samuel Archer. No photograph. Someone had taken only the picture. Not the name. Not the plaque. Just the face. I checked older photographs nearby. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. I counted 12 officers standing in a retirement picture dated 1998. Only 11 nameplates appeared beneath it. One name was missing. The empty space had been polished clean, as though a brass plate had once existed there. No scratch marks. No glue. Simply absence. I hurried to personnel records. Closed. The archive office was dark. Only emergency lighting illuminated the hallway with a dim amber glow. The building felt unusually warm despite the winter storm outside, while distant thunder rolled across the mountains with low, muffled echoes. Using my access card, I entered anyway. Personnel files lined hundreds of shelves. Alphabetical. Organized. Complete. I searched for Archer. Nothing. Morales. Present. Reynolds. Present. Collins. Present. Then I searched my own name. Officer Daniel Hale. Personnel file 44 to 117. I pulled the folder from the shelf. Inside, the hiring paperwork looked normal. Transfer request. Training certificates. Medical clearance. Everything exactly as expected. Until the final page. A document I had never seen. Printed on aging yellow paper instead of modern forms. The date at the top read, November 3, 1976. 30 years before I had even been born. The form listed only 3 lines. Replacement officer assigned. Previous officer, Hale. Continue existing procedures. I stared at the page, convinced it belonged in another file. Another person. Another Hale. There had to be dozens. Yet no first name appeared. Only the surname. Only mine. Before I could examine it further, the lights flickered. The air pressure inside the archive changed abruptly. My ears popped. The room became unnaturally quiet. Every clock visible through the open office door stopped at exactly 11:47. Not blinking. Not frozen. Simply waiting. Then, very softly, I heard footsteps. Not outside the office. Inside the archive. Walking slowly between the shelves. Measured. Professional. Exactly like an officer conducting routine rounds. One aisle over. Then another. Never hurrying. Never stopping. I held my breath. The footsteps grew closer. I could hear leather boots against polished concrete. A radio softly brushing against the uniform. The faint jingle of prison keys. Someone turned into the next aisle. I saw only the edge of a gray correctional sleeve disappear behind the shelving. I stepped forward. The aisle was empty. But resting neatly on the floor where no one had been a second earlier was my notebook. I was certain it had remained inside my pocket. It had been opened to the last page. A fresh sentence had appeared. The ink was still wet. It read. I read the sentence 3 times before I closed the notebook. You weren't hired. You were scheduled. The ink glistened beneath the archive's fluorescent lights, as though it had been written only seconds earlier. The room smelled of old paper, dust, and warm electrical wiring. Somewhere beyond the concrete walls, the heating system groaned through aging pipes, while a faint vibration traveled up from the boiler room below. I slipped the notebook back into my pocket. For the first time since arriving at Blackridge, I left a room without trying to understand what had happened inside it. I simply wanted to get out. The footsteps never returned. I barely slept over the next 2 days. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself walking the same corridor. Not running. Not hiding. Walking. The walls never changed. The lights always hummed. Cell numbers passed one after another. 10. 11. 12. 13. Then. Nothing. No 14. Just a blank section of wall. Yet every time I reached that empty stretch, I felt someone standing on the opposite side, patiently waiting for me to notice them. I always woke before I looked directly at the wall. By now I had accepted something that would have sounded absurd only weeks earlier. Blackridge wasn't trying to convince me of anything. It wasn't asking me to believe. It was asking me to continue. Every strange procedure. Every erased document. Every silent meal delivery. Every officer who looked away from Corridor D. They weren't protecting themselves. They were maintaining something. Whether they understood it or not. 3 nights later, Assistant Warden Collins assigned me to perimeter patrol. It made no sense. Winter storms had buried most of the outer roads beneath packed snow, leaving only narrow maintenance lanes between the fences. Wind swept across the open yard with enough force to shake the floodlights, while freezing mist drifted through the razor wire like pale smoke. The generators produced a steady mechanical growl that seemed louder in the open air. I signed out my flashlight. Checked the outer gates. Logged fence temperatures. Inspected emergency call boxes. Routine. Exactly the kind of work meant to keep an officer away from the housing units. As I finished the final checkpoint, my radio clicked. No static. No call sign. Just Morales. Hail. I'm here. Return inside. Problem? Yes. He paused. They've already started dinner. The transmission ended. Dinner. I looked at my watch. 9:52 p.m. Meal service had ended nearly 3 hours earlier. Without thinking, I hurried back toward the administration entrance. The corridors felt unusually warm after the bitter cold outside. Water dripped steadily from my boots onto polished concrete, carrying the smell of melting snow into the building. Officers passed me without speaking, each moving with the calm, practiced pace that had become so familiar. No alarms. No emergency announcements. Nothing suggested anything unusual had happened. Yet every veteran officer I passed avoided looking toward Corridor D. I found Morales waiting outside Central Control. His face looked pale beneath the fluorescent lights. You came back. You called. I wasn't sure you'd hear me. What happened? He looked toward the security monitors before answering. Someone forgot. Forgot what? The tray. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Reynolds emerged from Central Control carrying a covered stainless steel meal tray. The same white cloth. The same institutional dinner. Only tonight. His hands trembled. I'll take it, I offered. No. His answer came immediately. You've already been noticed. The words settled heavily between us. Reynolds adjusted the cloth. Without another sentence, he walked toward Corridor D. Morales sighed quietly. We have to follow. The hallways seemed darker than I remembered. Not because the lights had dimmed. Because the cold absorbed them. 45 degrees. Exactly? The air carried a damp mineral smell mixed with faint traces of cooked vegetables from the tray Reynolds carried. Every footstep echoed a little too long, bouncing off the concrete before disappearing into an unnatural silence ahead. We stopped outside cell 14. For the first time. 3 officers stood there together. No one spoke. Reynolds knelt. Unlocked the food slot. Then hesitated. He looked back at Morales. Morales nodded once. The tray slid slowly into the darkness. The metal scraped softly against concrete. Then stopped. Reynolds released it. Closed the hatch. Locked it. Nothing happened. 5 seconds. 10. 20. No spoon. No metallic tap. No acknowledgement. The silence became almost physical. I felt pressure building inside my ears. The fluorescent light above the door flickered once. Twice. Then every light in corridor D went out. Darkness swallowed the hallway. Only my flashlight remained. Its narrow beam cut through drifting condensation, revealing little beyond gray concrete and the white fog of our own breath. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for the door. Finally. A sound. Not from inside cell 14. From behind us. Another meal tray. Sliding slowly across the floor. I turned. The corridor behind us should have been empty. Instead, a stainless steel tray rested halfway down the hall. Still covered. Still steaming. No one had carried it there. Reynolds whispered, "Don't look inside." Morales answered quietly, "We have to." Neither man sounded frightened. Only resigned. Reynolds lifted the cloth. The tray was empty. No food. Only a folded incident report. Yellow paper. Old. Very old. Across the top someone had typed, "Procedure 6. My pulse quickened. Reynolds unfolded the page carefully. Half the text had faded beyond recognition. Only several lines remained readable. If scheduled maintenance fails. Another missing section. Then. Continue ordinary operations. Another gap. Near the bottom. Replacement personnel must never be informed before. The remainder had been torn away decades earlier. No signature. No date. Just one handwritten note across the margin. Routine is containment. The lights returned. Instantly. The corridor looked exactly as before. The second tray was gone. Reynolds still held the paper. Only now. The words had vanished. The page was blank. He folded it without comment. Placed it inside his pocket. "I've seen enough," I said quietly. Morales looked at me with tired eyes. "No." He shook his head once. "You've seen exactly what you're supposed to." We began walking back towards Central Control. I was the last in line. Halfway down the corridor, something made me glance over my shoulder. The inspection shutter on cell 14 had opened again. Only an inch. The darkness behind the reinforced glass remained complete. Then a voice came softly from within. Not tired. Not threatening. Almost gentle. "Officer Hale." It was the first time it had used my full title. I kept walking. "Officer Hale." Another step. "You forgot your report." My hand tightened around the notebook in my pocket. I didn't turn around. The voice spoke one final time. Quiet enough that I almost mistook it for the heating system. "We'll see you tomorrow." No one else reacted. Neither Morales nor Reynolds looked back. Neither asked whether I had heard anything. When we reached the end of Corridor D, Morales stopped beside the security gate. Without facing me, he spoke in a voice barely louder than a whisper. "It always says tomorrow." I looked at him. "What if I don't come back?" For the first time since I had met him. He smiled. Not happily. Sadly. "You already did." The gate closed behind us with a heavy metallic thud. I didn't sleep that morning. And for the rest of my shift, I couldn't stop wondering whether the prison expected me to return the following night. Or whether, somehow, it already remembered that I had. I resigned 3 weeks later. At least, that's what I remember. I completed the exit paperwork in the administration building on a gray morning in early March. Outside, the last of the winter's snow melted into shallow puddles that reflected the razor wire and watchtowers. Cold rain tapped steadily against reinforced windows while the familiar smell of damp concrete drifted through the heating vents. Assistant Warden Collins sat across from me with a thin personnel folder. He didn't try to persuade me to stay. He simply slid the resignation form across the desk. "If you're certain." "I am." He nodded. "I expected you would be." No farewell speech. No questions about future employment. No discussion of why I was leaving. Only signatures. Routine. Exactly like every other procedure inside Blackridge. Before I stood, Collins placed one final envelope on the desk. "No need to open it here." "What is it?" "Your schedule. I just resigned." "I know." He looked at me for several seconds. Then quietly added, "It belongs to whoever comes next." I left the envelope unopened. Driving away from Blackridge should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt strangely incomplete. The narrow mountain road wound through dense pine forests still coated in patches of melting snow. Fog drifted between the trees, reducing visibility to only a few hundred feet. My truck's tires hissed over wet pavement, while the prison gradually disappeared behind the weather. I expected my radio to regain reception. It didn't. For nearly 2 hours. Only static. Then, without warning, a calm voice spoke through the truck speakers. Not dispatch. Not emergency services. Just one sentence. "Shift change begins in 10 minutes. The transmission ended. The radio returned to static. When I checked the dashboard clock, it read exactly 11:47. I threw the notebook away before I reached the nearest town. I stopped at a gas station. Walked to a dumpster behind the building. Dropped it inside. Watched it land beneath broken cardboard boxes and old coffee cups. Then I drove home. For the first time in months, I believed I was finished. The next morning, the notebook rested on my kitchen table. Closed. Dry. Untouched. I stared at it for several minutes before convincing myself I had imagined throwing it away. Maybe I'd left it in my truck. Maybe I had carried it inside without remembering. Sleep deprivation explained a lot. Or so I kept telling myself. I opened it. The final page remained blank. Nothing else. No new writing. I almost laughed. Perhaps everything was finally over. Life became quieter after leaving the prison. I accepted a position at a county detention center closer to home. Smaller facility. Shorter shifts. More staff. The ordinary frustrations of correctional work returned. Paperwork. Arguments. Equipment failures. Real problems. Comfortingly normal problems. Gradually, Blackridge became something I avoided thinking about. Months passed. Then years. The nightmares became less frequent. Eventually they stopped altogether. At least, the obvious ones did. Certain habits never disappeared. I still checked every clock I walked past. I still counted my footsteps without realizing it. Every time I entered a hallway, I looked automatically for missing numbers on the doors. If someone paused too long before speaking, I caught myself waiting for a radio to crackle. The routine stayed with me. Long after the prison didn't. Nearly 4 years later, I received a phone call. Unknown number. The voice identified herself as a state records administrator. "We're updating retired personnel files. I think you have the wrong person. Did you work at Blackridge Correctional Unit 7? Yes. We've located an inconsistency. What kind? A missing exit interview. I completed one. Our records indicate otherwise." She sounded genuinely confused. According to the archive. There was a pause as she turned pages. "Your employment at Blackridge has never ended." I laughed. "I resigned years ago. I'm looking at your active personnel record." Silence settled between us. Finally she apologized. I'll contact Human Resources. The call ended. Curiosity 1. For the first time since leaving, I submitted a formal request for my employment records. The envelope arrived 2 weeks later. Inside were photocopies of every document from my personnel file. Transfer request. Training certificates. Medical evaluations. Performance reviews. Everything appeared normal. Until the last page. It wasn't my resignation. It was next month's work schedule. My name appeared exactly where it always had. Night shift. Housing inspection. Corridor D. No resignation paperwork existed. No exit interview. No final payroll. According to the state, I had never left. I drove to the Department of Corrections headquarters hoping someone could explain the mistake. The records supervisor searched every database available. Nothing. No resignation. I handed it directly to the warden. No record. What about payroll? You've continued declining direct deposit. I haven't. She frowned. That's what the file says. I asked one final question. Can I have Blackridge's current phone number? She looked puzzled. We don't list direct numbers for decommissioned facilities. I froze. Decommissioned? She turned the monitor toward me. Blackridge Correctional Unit 7. Officially closed. 12 years earlier. Every inmate transferred. Every employee reassigned. Buildings abandoned. I stared at the screen. 12 years? She nodded. There hasn't been anyone stationed there since. I couldn't speak. Because I had worked there. I remembered the officers. The inmates. Morales. Reynolds. Collins. The endless inspections. The winter storms. The meal deliveries. All of it. Years after the prison had supposedly closed. I tried finding news reports. Satellite photographs. Government archives. Very little remained. Most records simply referred to Blackridge as an obsolete correctional facility closed after structural concerns. No mention of Corridor D. No mention of Cell 14. No mention of anyone named Samuel Archer. Or Morales. Or Reynolds. Even Collins. It was as though the people I remembered had never existed. Only one thing refused to disappear. The notebook. I locked it inside a fireproof safe at home. I never opened it again. For years. Then, last winter, curiosity returned. Outside, freezing rain struck my windows with the same quiet rhythm I remembered from the prison. The house was silent except for the steady hum of the furnace and the occasional creak of settling wood. I unlocked the safe. The notebook lay exactly where I had left it. Dust covered the cover. Nothing seemed unusual. I opened to the last page. Still blank. I almost closed it. Then I noticed something. The paper wasn't blank anymore. The writing was so faint I almost missed it. Not fresh ink. More like old pencils slowly becoming visible. One line. Only one. Meal delivered. Beneath it, a second line appeared while I watched. Not quickly. Slowly. Letter by letter. As though an invisible hand pressed into the paper from the other side. Occupant status present. I shut the notebook immediately. I haven't opened it since. I don't know whether the words are still there. I don't know whether they were ever really there. I've stopped trying to prove any of it. People ask why I left corrections. I usually tell them I wanted a quieter life. That's easier than telling the truth. Because the truth isn't that I worked at a remote prison with an empty cell. The truth is that somewhere, whether on paper, in memory, or in a place that no longer officially exists, someone is still following the schedule. Someone is still preparing a dinner tray every night. Someone is still sliding it through the food slot of cell 14. And every night, after a few moments of perfect silence, someone still waits to hear a spoon touch steel before they walk away. I hope that routine never stops. Because after everything I experienced, I've come to believe one thing. The meal was never meant to feed whoever was inside. It was meant to keep them from coming out.